Chapter 5 Ashes and Claws. Will crept through the stark, winding corridors of the Lazarus Institute, his every step measured, careful. The pristine white walls stretched endlessly, their smooth surfaces untouched by time or decay. Yet beneath the sterile perfection, the place felt wrong, like it was alive, watching him from every corner. A faint rhythmic hum pulsed through the walls, vibrating under his fingertips as he brushed against the cold metal railing. Machinery, unseen but ever present, whispered through the air like the lab itself was breathing. His flashlight flickered, the weak glow cutting through the darkness in jagged slashes. The corridor ahead yawned like a tunnel into the unknown, stretching beyond the reach of his beam. Then he heard it, a muffled groan. Will froze, his pulse spiking. The sound was faint but unmistakable, human, pained. He swallowed hard, his breath steady but shallow. He followed the sound, his footsteps light, his body coiled with tension. The hallway narrowed, walls pressing in as he reached a heavy metal door. A faint glow seeped from its edges, casting an eerie halo on the floor. The Lazarus insignia was stamped across its surface in sleek black lettering. Below it, bold red warnings screamed at him, restricted access, highly volatile materials. Will clenched his jaw. What the hell is behind this door? Pressing his ear against the cold steel, he listened. The groans were clearer now, laced with exhaustion. Faint beeps and the soft whir of machines hummed beyond the barrier, the mechanical sounds blending with labored breathing. Will inhaled slowly. Then, keeping his movements precise, he curled his fingers around the handle and eased the door open. A rush of sterile, frigid air hit him as he slipped inside. The room was a twisted version of something out of a horror movie. Rows of patients lined the walls, strapped to narrow metallic beds, their bodies writhing in agony. Tubes snaked from their arms and necks, pumping strange glowing fluids into their veins. Some convulsed violently, their limbs jerking as if electrified. Others let out weak, pained moans, their eyes rolling back into their skulls. The room reeked of antiseptic, blood, and something deeper, something rotten, unnatural. Will's eyes swept across the room, his stomach twisting at the sight of the massive glass tanks lining the far wall. The eerie glow inside them barely illuminated their contents, but it was enough. Twisted figures floated in the strange liquid, half-formed things caught between human and something else. Their limbs were elongated, their skin warped with patches of fur, scales, and grotesque mutations. It was worse than anything he had imagined. Will swallowed hard, his stomach twisting as he forced himself to look past them. The slow, rhythmic beeping of machines filled the silence, blending with the labored breathing of the dying test subjects, the mechanical heartbeat of this horrific place. And then, his eyes locked onto the figure in the center of the room. Will's breath caught in his throat. Keith! He rushed forward, barely aware of his own voice echoing in the vast, sterile chamber. Keith was strapped down, his wrists and ankles locked in heavy restraints. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, his face pale and sickly. The veins beneath his skin pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, spreading jagged patterns up his arms. Will's hands shook as he reached for the straps. What the hell did they do to you, man? Keith stirred, his head rolling weakly toward Will. His eyelids fluttered, unfocused. Will? His voice was barely a whisper, cracked and raw. You shouldn't have come. Will exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Come on, bro. You know better than that. I wasn't about to leave you in here. Keith managed a weak, breathless laugh. They'll kill you. Not if they don't catch us, Will muttered, yanking at the straps. He tried not to look at the unnatural ridges pressing beneath Keith's skin, as if something was lurking just underneath the surface, something waiting. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate. A voice, smooth as silk but laced with quiet disdain, echoed from behind them. Ah, Specimen 7 found his way back. How amusing. Will spun around, his body tensing, as a figure emerged from the shadows. The doctor moved with unsettling ease, his pristine white coat barely shifting as he stepped forward. His eyes, unnatural glowing yellow, fixed on Will with mild amusement, as if he were watching a rat trying to escape a cage. There was something wrong about the way he stood, almost animalistic. Will clenched his fists, forcing his voice to stay steady. Who the hell are you? The doctor sighed as if the question bored him. Another one that talks before thinking. He waved a dismissive hand. It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you've made a mistake coming here. His gaze flickered toward Keith, barely sparing him a second glance. And you, Specimen 79, still clinging to your humanity, I see. Will felt his stomach twist. What did you do to him? The doctor's expression didn't change. The same thing we've done to all of them. He gestured lazily toward the other test subjects strapped to the machines, their bodies twitching and writhing. Some adapt. Most don't. That's how progress is made. Will's hands curled into fists. You treat people like test animals. They are test animals, the doctor said, his voice devoid of emotion. And so are you. The doctor sighed again, shaking his head. Enough of this. Then with inhuman speed he lunged. Will barely dodged the attack, grabbing a nearby tray and hurling it at the hybrid. It clattered harmlessly to the floor as the hybrid advanced, its movements fluid and inhumanly fast. You're wasting my time, growled the hybrid, lunging again. Keith groaned, his entire body trembling as he pushed himself up from the metal table. His vision swam, the sterile white lights above blurring into streaks. A sharp, unnatural sensation crawled beneath his skin, like something trying to force its way out. Then pain. A guttural snarl ripped from his throat as his fingers curled into fists. The skin along his wrist split open with a sickening tear, and something sharp, something wrong, pushed its way through the wounds. Claws. Thick, curved talons burst from his skin, slick with fresh blood. Keith gasped, his breath ragged as the pain twisted through him like fire. His heart pounded, his senses sharpening, the sterile smell of the lab replaced by something else, something primal, a deep, unshakable hunger to rip and tear. His body moved before his mind could catch up. With a savage growl, Keith lunged, his muscles locking into place like a coiled spring. His speed was unnatural, almost feral, closing the gap between him and the doctor in an instant. The two collided with a crash, Keith's claws raking across the doctor's chest. The fabric of the white coat shredded like paper, and a dark, oily substance seeped from the deep gashes beneath. The doctor stumbled back, but his glowing yellow eyes narrowed, focused, calculating. Keith's breath came in ragged pants, his pulse hammering in his ears. He barely recognized the sound of his own breathing. It was deeper, heavier, laced with something raw and inhuman. You're just a pawn, Specimen 79, a failed experiment. The doctor muttered. Keith snarled as his claws grew, his movements becoming more primal. Specimen 79? Keith asked, confused, looking down at his bloody talons. Well, let's see how failed I am when I rip your ass apart. Will spotted a spray can on a nearby counter and snatched it up. Flicking his trusty lighter open, he aimed the makeshift flamethrower at the hybrid and let loose. Flames roared to life, engulfing the doctor as he thrashed wildly. Keith darted forward, his claws slicing through the hybrid's neck in a final devastating blow. The hybrid collapsed to the ground, its body twitching before going still. Keith stared at his hands, his breathing ragged. I did that? Damn right you did, Will said, slapping him on the shoulder. Now let's get the hell out of here. They burst through a side exit, the cool night air slamming into them like a wave. The salty wind whipped against their faces, carrying the distant crash of waves against the seawall. Where to? Keith panted, his breath ragged, his glow flickering like a dying flame. Will's eyes darted across the landscape. The city was behind them, but ahead the open beach stretched into the darkness. The dunes. We'll lose them in the dunes. They took off sprinting. Behind them, the distant whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors grew louder, cutting through the night. Lazarus troopers flooded onto the sand, their heavy boots sinking into the dunes as they advanced. Searchlights from the choppers swept across the beach, locking onto their fleeing forms. Keith's claws extended instinctively as he turned to face the oncoming wave of troopers. His breathing was heavy, wild. Go! I'll hold them off. No way. Will shot back, gripping a broken piece of driftwood like a bat. We stick together. The first wave of troopers rushed forward, their weapons crackling with electric energy. Keith moved first. He was a blur of motion, lunging into them with animalistic speed, his claws slicing through armor and flesh alike. Sparks flew as he shattered weapons with brute strength, his strikes leaving deep gashes in the sand. Will swung his driftwood with all his might, knocking a trooper to the ground, but more kept coming. A helicopter swooped in low, its spotlight blinding them. The deafening roar of the rotor blades drowned out everything else. Keith crouched low, his muscles coiling like a predator ready to strike. Then, with a snarl, he pounced. Keith smashed through the cockpit, shards of reinforced glass exploding around him. The pilot barely had time to gasp before Keith's clawed hand seized his collar. With a savage yank, Keith ripped him from the seat, dragging him violently to the ground as they crashed to the sand below. The chopper lurched wildly, spinning out of control, The tail rotor clipped the sand and the entire aircraft plummeted, slamming into the dunes in a fiery explosion. Got him! Will shouted over the roar of the flames. Got him! Keith echoed, landing back on the beach, his glowing veins pulsing faintly beneath his skin. But they weren't in the clear yet. More troopers advanced, this time with heavier weapons. One raised a bulky rifle and fired. A net shot through the air, expanding mid-flight like a metallic web. It struck Keith square in the chest, wrapping around him in a tangle of steel cables. A surge of electricity coursed through the net, sending him sprawling into the sand with a painful roar. Will's heart pounded. He turned just in time to see more troopers closing in. He swung his driftwood wildly, knocking one trooper back, but it wasn't enough. There were too many of them. A rifle butt smashed into the side of his head. White-hot pain exploded through his skull, but then something happened. A strange fiery energy surged through his veins, flooding every inch of his body. His vision blurred, his senses warping. He felt heavy, like something inside of him was waking up. His eyes burned, then suddenly they glowed. A piercing white light erupted from them. A trooper took a step back. What the hell? Boom! A pulse of fiery white energy exploded from Will's hands. The force sent the remaining troopers flying, their bodies tumbling across the sand like rag dolls. Their bodies clattered to the ground, scorched and lifeless. The electrical trap fizzled out and Keith gasped as he felt the current die. Keith slashed through the remnants of the net, the sharp edges of his claws ripping through steel like paper. He climbed to his feet, breathing heavily, his veins still glowing faintly. He turned to Will, who stood there, his hands still crackling with raw, untamed power. Will, they got you too? But you're different, Keith said, his voice laced with disbelief. Will's hands trembled, flickers of white flame still sparking around them. His breathing was uneven, his mind racing. I don't know what's happening, man, he said, shaking his head. I can't control this. Keith hesitated, then stepped forward. Slowly he reached out, placing his clawed hand on Will's shoulder, a steadying gesture between them. Me neither, Keith admitted, his own power still pulsing just beneath the surface. But let's figure this shit out together. They turned to face the wreckage around them, the burning helicopter, the clawed-up, scorched bodies. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Epilogue. The Overseer. A dim, sterile glow illuminated the Lazarus Institute's high-security control room. The walls were lined with monitors, each one displaying a different feed. Satellite footage of the burning wreckage on the beach, biometric scans, and dozens of live video feeds from hidden surveillance drones. The air was thick with quiet tension, the only sound the soft hum of machines and the occasional tap of fingers against a sleek console. Dr. Edward Lazarus stood in the center of the room, his sharp gaze locked onto the largest screen, which displayed Will and Keith standing amidst the ruins of the battle. His expression was unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he analyzed every detail. A soft chime rang out as a door slid open behind him. A woman in a crisp white lab coat stepped inside, a tablet clutched tightly to her chest. She hesitated before speaking. Sir, the containment teams are standing by. Orders? Lazarus didn't respond immediately. He continued watching the footage, his gaze narrowing slightly as Will's fiery white energy flickered and danced around his trembling hands. Another assistant, a nervous-looking man adjusting his glasses, spoke up. They'll destabilize the project. We should neutralize them before they... No. Lazarus finally spoke, his voice smooth and absolute. The assistant hesitated. But sir... Lazarus turned his head slightly, his expression darkening. The assistant swallowed hard and fell silent. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Lazarus's lips as he turned back to the screen. Let them go. The woman holding the tablet frowned. Are you sure? We have the resources to retrieve them now. If we wait too long, we risk losing control over their... Control? Lazarus chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. They were never in control to begin with. He gestured toward the screen where Will and Keith stood amidst the carnage, looking just as shocked by their own abilities as the soldiers who had fallen before them. They think they've escaped, that they're free. The woman shifted uncomfortably. And you're just letting them run? Lazarus turned fully now, stepping toward her with a calculated slowness. His presence was overwhelming, his mere gaze enough to make seasoned scientists uneasy. I want to see what they do next, he said simply. How far they'll go. How far their powers will take them before they begin to burn. This is an opportunity to gather valuable field research. He turned back to the screen, his smile widening. And we wouldn't want to waste that opportunity, would we? The nervous assistant hesitated before glancing at another monitor displaying biometric readings. And what about the other subjects? Lazarus's smirk deepened. The assistant followed his gaze to another screen, one that showed a vast, darkened lab lined with containment tanks. The soft glow of liquid illuminated the vague, shifting silhouettes inside. Some were humanoid, others less so. They're not ready yet, Lazarus murmured, but soon. The screen flickered, revealing a deeper level of the facility, one even most of the Lazarus personnel never laid eyes on. There, behind reinforced glass, something shifted in the darkness. A pair of eyes, glowing, intense, snapped open. Lazarus watched for a moment longer before turning to his team. His voice was calm, measured, as if he were discussing nothing more than a routine experiment. Let them think they're free, if for now. The power will consume them eventually, and if it doesn't, he paused, his smirk returning. I'll bring them back when I'm ready.